This is the Observations Podcast for Sunday, the 17th of September, 2023. We are back after a 2-week hiatus. I had a holiday and personal obligations that interfered, but we are back with the podcast. It's good to be back with you. I'm Dale Franks.
I'm Michael Wade.
And we are back after 2 weeks. There's probably a lot of current event stuff that we could talk about, but current event stuff comes and goes, right? I want to talk about something less current and less eventy, which is about our institutions. We have just gone through this long period of these Hunter Biden investigations where it seems like the Justice Department wanted to give him a sweetheart deal, although that got swept away by a federal judge who had some, let's say, queries.
Ask some simple questions.
Yeah, just asked a couple of questions and it all kind of fell apart. And of course, we know the whole COVID thing with the CDC and the vaccines and some of the stuff that we have learned about that, about the lab leak theory. Our institutions are broken. And I've seen a lot of stuff on Twitter. In fact, we've talked about it here about, defund the FBI. Just get rid of it. There's a whole bunch of institutions that people have noticed are, here's the complication. They're failing in some specific circumstances. And yet on a and by the way, important things. They're failing at big, important things. And yet they're still competent on a day-to-day basis. Right? Forget what the Justice Department does with Joe Biden, which we know that there seems to be a finger on the scale of justice there. But you go and try to rob a couple of banks and cross state lines, the FBI will find you. You kidnap a kid, the FBI will come down on you like a ton of bricks. On a day-to-day basis, the FBI, Secret Service, ATF, whatever, they do what they're supposed to do. Academia does what it's supposed to do. If there was an outbreak of a known disease, like, something very deadly, like hemorrhagic fever, I have no doubt that the CDC would know exactly what needs to be done to contain an outbreak like that and to squelch it. So we have these institutions that work on a day-to-day basis and yet are operated in such a way, intentionally, by the way. This is not an accident. I think this is intentional. They're intentionally designed to fail whenever they're confronted with certain narratives that they want to enforce. And I think the question is, what do we do about that? As a society, we have to have many, many institutions, whether they are government institutions or non-governmental organizations or schools or churches or, charities. Our society is filled with institutions, financial institutions, whose sole purpose is to kind of ease our way through maintaining a complex technological civilization. And on a day-to-day basis, they do that. But when they do fail, the failures are both big and intentional. And it seems sometimes, and this is where the conundrum is, it seems like these institutions are not reformable, at least not under their current leadership. And yet we can't just blow them away because we have to have something that replaces them. They can't just simply cease to exist. And that's something I've been thinking about. I don't know how to square that circle.
Well, it depends on the institution. The FBI could easily, we didn't have an FBI, until the 30s or 20s. We had, Treasury agents, you had G-men. You didn't necessarily have the FBI, a centralized Bureau of Investigation.
Well, I would point out, I saw somebody earlier this week who said something about, how will we have, what will we do for federal law enforcement without the FBI? And I wrote back, well, gosh, That would be tough because then we'd only be left with the Secret Service, BATF, DEA, DHS, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, their police, the Department of Agriculture's cops, the IRS, the Postal Service inspectors.
The Postal Service.
Well,
yeah.
It seems like there's plenty of federal law enforcement outside the FBI. Yes, the FBI is kind of the central clearinghouse for all of this when it comes to criminal investigation. But the fact is, I mean, there's no shortage of federal agencies. So, in the case of the FBI,
well, and that's right.
In the case of the FBI, could we get rid of the FBI? Yeah, sure. We probably could. And I'm sure that the multiplicity of federal agencies, both on the civilian and the Department of Defense side, could probably pick up that slack relatively easily. But could we do without higher education institutions? Could we do without all law enforcement? Could we do the defund the police movement? Okay. Show me a society, how it remains stable without an institution of policing. We can get rid of, we can chop off bits of it here and there and probably be fine. But the institution itself, we just can't willy-nilly get rid of it. There was this Minnesota politician who was really big in defunding the police, who this last week was the victim of a violent carjacking, and she was also the victim of a battery.
She was brutally beaten. Yeah.
Yeah. She was beaten pretty severely, and she was like, well, we need the police for this. Oh, well, okay. Interesting.
She was very thankful to the police and the job they did.
Yeah. Interesting. That wasn't what you were saying last year. And that's an example of what happens when you're the policy that you've espoused for basically moral preening actually has real world results, which is an example of you can't get rid of the institution. So we have these institutions. They fail on big things. They fail intentionally. They lie and knowingly lie. And yet on a day-to-day basis, they work. I don't know how to fix that.
Well, I mean, I guess, first of all, the institutions you're talking about are all essentially federal institutions.
Yeah, but we can talk about the same thing with local police. We can talk about how local medical care sort of knuckled under to the CDC.
A separate issue, because it's the federal agencies, federal institutions. And what are some of the big ones? I mean, obviously the FBI, the SEC is a huge one. The EPA is an incredibly large and powerful one that affects people's lives all over the country. Certainly the court system, the DOJ. I mean, those are the institutions that we depend on to administer and enforce federal law that, like you said, on a day-to-day basis, on a with regular types of crimes or
breach of contract disputes.
Right. I mean, they do basically fine. Certainly no worse than their state counterparts in most cases. But it's when it comes to these bigger political issues that they fall down, or that they choose a side, essentially.
Yeah, you can't even say that they're failing. You can't even say that they're falling down. You can't even say that they're making mistakes. They're picking a side. This is not accidental. This is not incompetence. This is malevolence.
And how do you prevent that? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I honestly don't, because you don't want a political litmus test. Matter of fact, we have it enshrined in the law that you can't have one. Although strangely, not very many conservatives make it into the bureaucracy. And you don't want that to become, or maybe you do. I don't know. Maybe a spoils system is the way to go. You clean it out every 4 to 8 years, and just kind of go from scratch. I mean, we lose some institutional knowledge, but maybe that's the fair way to go. I don't know. It seems like things ran a lot better back when there was a spoils system.
Well,
We didn't have civil
civil service reform and civil service protection,
right, yeah.
and government employee unions. You mentioned something interesting about the bureaucracy. There's not a lot of conservatives in the bureaucracy. Okay, is that a function of the bureaucracy, or is that a function of self-selection? Because
there's certainly, I think there is a certain amount of self-selection. But when you get into those higher up echelons, the people who have been around the longest are not the conservatives. They burn out the quickest, and they're more willing to go back into the political realm, the lobbying realm, than stick around, get a steady paycheck, have that gold pension and all the benefits and whatever else. Whereas the people who tend to love government are more than happy to just suck it up, stick it out, fight off rivals. I mean, I've known, not all of them conservative, but I've known several people involved in the federal bureaucracy and different agencies. And morale is always, always, always a problem. There's so much backstabbing and infighting and agenda pushing that it wears people down fairly quickly.
See, I think the key phrase is the one that you just mentioned and tossed it off like it didn't mean anything. Those people who love government are willing to join the bureaucracy.
Yeah,
that's the problem with conservatives and libertarians. They don't love government, and they tend not to see government service, especially at the civil service level, as the kind of career field that you would find particularly rewarding, because
right.
You're part of, from the libertarian or conservative point of view, you are part of the problem. The second you say, hey,
although there are a lot of libertarians who like to get into government, like the Ron Swanson type, and then absolutely nothing.
Yeah. Ron Swanson is like the perfect libertarian in government. But this is the conundrum that we face, and I don't know how to fix it. And the people on especially on the sort of the MAGA crowd, I guess I'll call them for lack of any better term, who are just all in. You see it with people like Kurt Schlichter and others. And I wouldn't point to Kurt Schlichter as being MAGA. He seems pretty pro DeSantis at this point, and seems pretty convinced that Trump cannot win the 2024 election.
He's just a realist Republican.
Yeah, he's more of a realist. But again, even as a realist, he is on the let's just destroy the FBI.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. But who is then going to go after the bank robbers, the kidnappers, and how somebody has to do it. That institution in some form has to exist.
And how does that prevent the same kind of corruption entering, the Treasury Department or the IRS, to the extent it's not already there?
See, it's not a solution, right? I mean, it's a quick fix for it's like, if I have a headache, and I have a headache because I have some sort of viral infection, and the doctor looks at me and says, oh, you have a headache? Well, here, take 2 aspirin and call me in the morning. That might very well fix my headache, but the headache isn't the problem.
There's just covering up the symptoms.
Right. Getting rid of the FBI doesn't fix the problem. The problem is, how do you prevent these institutions from becoming corrupted to the point where they take sides where, there's not very many cases where the institution should take sides. The institutions are supposed to be impartial. And yet they're not. And by the way, we're talking about the federal government, but let's talk about the private sector. Let's talk about Vanguard or BlackRock. Although Vanguard has at least publicly backed off of this in the last month or so, the pushing of environmental and social goals,
governance.
The ESG/DEI requirements that they can put on any business, because either Vanguard or BlackRock, it doesn't matter. These are massive institutions with trillions, literally, of dollars that they can throw into. They can easily become the largest shareholder, if not the majority shareholder, in pretty much any company that they want to. And they get themselves a board seat and they can throw their weight around. And they've jumped fully into, ESG slash DEI and the old Milton Friedman idea that the purpose of a corporation is solely to have a fiduciary duty to make money for its shareholders kind of goes out the window. And these are private institutions. It's not like the government can just disband them by law.
Right. Well, and there's no equivalent of, say, like Ralph Nader on the right. Although there are a couple of groups that have started. So like what Ralph Nader would do was go in, buy up some shares, get a voice at the board meetings when electing officers and whatnot, push the agenda, threaten lawsuits and all kinds of stuff. And they were able to bend the will of corporations on some things. Environmental stuff was Nader's big thing. And there are a couple of groups that have started to do that with like BlackRock. I mean, there's only so much you can do with BlackRock. It's a hedge fund. So it holds, sorry, there's a rip in the time and space continuum. Oh shit. I'm going to die.
The alternate universe is now poking through. There's a portal behind you.
Let's just hope Ralph Nader doesn't step through it. Anyway, so there's really not that kind of caucus, that kind of groundswell on the right to push back. Now you are seeing it coming from the Twitter right against these groups that and governments who are pushing back against the restraining of free speech by Facebook, by Twitter, by Instagram, and whatnot. And that's important, and that's been quite successful so far. So successful, in fact, in the the Missouri v. Biden case, which I believe is still in the Fifth Circuit. The Biden administration is getting their asses handed to them, as they should. What they did was essentially, since the government couldn't directly stifle people's speech, cancel them, take away their platforms, they put tremendous amounts of pressure on these private companies to do so, with the not so subtle threat of, well, it's a nice company you got there, too bad if some regulations were to happen to it.
No direct threats, just kind of veiled allusions to regulation and Section 230.
And a lot of force. They were very, very demanding. Like, did you not hear what I said? I told you to take this down. Why are these things still up? Just expect it. If the government can't do it, then a private company can't do it at the behest of the government. It's like what most people recognize as entrapment law. You can't extend the government's power through a private company to make it clean. There's no laundering of government power. That's not how it works.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, speaking of entrapment, the Gretchen Whitmer kidnapping trial turned out pretty badly for the government this week.
I still don't know how they got two guys convicted.
Well, also, I think they pled guilty to lesser charges too.
Maybe that's what I didn't follow it that closely. To be honest.
But the people who said no, I'm not guilty, prove it. They ended up getting acquitted this week. So interesting sideline. But There are a couple of people who are trying to Ralph Nader it. Like in education, there is FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. They
There's
largely,
Christopher Rufo, there's Corey DeAngelis.
yeah, they largely concentrate at the college level and on pure academia. And then you also have some University of Chicago is one who just flatly says, all of this hate speech and all this other stuff, that's just not going to fly here. This is Chicago. We're a free speech school. And if you can't handle it, maybe you should go to Harvard or Yale or Princeton, where they will call you. We will not. So, there are outliers, and there are some groups who are trying to sort of Ralph Nader these institutions from the right. But boy, they do seem few and far between. I wonder if part of the problem is that, if you have a political philosophy that assumes, as Ronald Reagan said, the most scary words in the world are "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." If that's your philosophy of government, you're probably not all of that interested in trying to oversee government. Most people on that side of the political spectrum want to be left alone, and they want to, get on with their lives.
There's a personal cost.
Yeah.
I mean, these people, look at Moms for Liberty. They haven't even been around very long, and they're mostly at the elementary, high school level. They've been called extremists and white supremacists by SPLC, which I don't know why anybody listens to them anymore, as if they have any credibility whatsoever.
By the way, keep talking. I'm listening.
And, the pure personal cost of speaking out against these movements and regimes, whether it's, critical race theory, whether it's wokeness in schools, the gender ideology being pushed on kids, pornography being pushed on kids. You speak out against this stuff, you're labeled as a bigot, fascist. They hunt you down, they dox you, they try to get you fired from your job, and they get some people fired from their job. So there's a serious personal cost to doing this. Riley Gaines, who's spoken out in favor of women's sports and trying to get trans women out of there, to make it fair. I mean, she's been attacked mercilessly. She gave a speech it was in San Francisco State or somewhere, and they held her hostage for 2 hours, demanded ransom. I mean, that's a high personal cost to have to pay in order to speak out and speak the truth. So, of course, a lot of people don't want to get super involved.
Well, that gets us into a really dark area because, yeah, there is, I think, among many people, this willingness to jump in and try to punish you for saying things that they don't like. We see that a lot on Twitter. We see people who, sort of go out and try to dox you or try to give the name of your kid's elementary school or whatever. There are certainly bad actors who just jump on the bandwagon to do bad actor things. The real problem, it seems to me, and I hate to talk like a conspiracy theorist here, but it's how much of this pushback actually comes directly from the government. How much of it, let's take the UFO thing. Now we can, I'm uninterested in having a debate about whether there are aliens or not. But one of the real fears among people who have made UFO sightings when it comes to reporting them is not that their fellow pilots or whoever will think they're nuts. They fear that the FAA or other arms of the government will come after them to try to discredit them. And it's interesting, whenever somebody starts getting close to unpleasant truths, how often bad things happen to them. Now, I don't know anything about this case, so let me state that outright. I don't know the truth or falsity of any of these allegations. But Russell Brand, one of the last people who you would think would be super anti-government or a super righty, he is not. But he has just been skeptical of government narratives and has been pretty popular in expressing that skepticism. And now all of a sudden people have just come out of the woodwork and accused him of all sorts of, sexual misconduct. True?
Yeah.
Not true? Is this because he gets into talking about, defense and intelligence related issues and how he doesn't believe some of these narratives. Is there, and how, or I won't even say is there, how much of a sanctioned government discrediting, and we've certainly seen it with the Twitter files, and this is a more public version of going after people intentionally, calling out people by name to be banned for violation of terms of service in the government's view. We know that they do it overtly. Why shouldn't we believe that they also do it covertly?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Russell Brand's sort of like, I guess, the poor man's Chris Hitchens when it comes to skepticism.
Yes, everyone is the poor man's Chris Hitchens.
Well, that's a fair point. But he asks good questions. He's sort of like Joe Rogan in a way. I mean, he just asks some really good, insightful questions, and he's willing to listen to people answer. And now he may argue with the answers. He may ask even more questions and really try to dive down. Matter of fact, he usually does. But he's actually inquisitive, and he gets a little offended when he gets written off, as he should. I mean, he's really not doing anything other than being skeptical.
Yeah, and by the way,
right, the timing of this is very suspect.
And by the way, is it odd that two of the most interesting and popular, I guess we could call them truth seekers or questioners, in our society today happen to be two comedians?
Yeah, that's true. Well, and that's, that's always been the sign of a good comedian. Somebody who would really investigate the truth and then deliver it to you in a funny way, in a palatable way, while skewering whoever is being, hoist on the petards.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's just inherent in that career choice.
Well, I think that they're naturally insightful people who just really kind of penetrate what the hell is going on here and really want to take a look at it and try to figure that out.
But I guess we don't have any answers for the institutional problem, though. We had one of our viewers says mandatory participation in IG investigations for all government workers would help. Would it, though?
Yeah, that would be cumbersome, to say the least.
Well, it also assumes that the IG has an interest in getting to the bottom of something and dealing out the appropriate penalties themselves.
Right. That's always, who watches the watcher, right? I mean, one of the fallacies of the good governance types is that, well, if you just get the right people in here, then, we can trust them. If they're in the government, they're not self-interested.
That is the dumbest argument imaginable.
We have an entire study of self-interest in public institutions called public choice theory, started by James Buchanan, that it pretty much lays bare just how idiotic of an argument that is. That all people are self-interested, no matter what job they take. Now, I would argue that the vast majority of us will put our clients ahead of ourselves because that's what keeps us in business and uh, creates our reputation and ultimately wealth. But that doesn't mean that there's not going to be self-interest. And when two interests are not aligned, and you're not directing my client, such as a U.S. voter, because I work for the government, and you didn't elect me, we're not lined up. We're not in an agency principle situation. So
Well, the
I'm going to do
difficulty
whatever I think is best.
the difficulty is not just personal incentives. I mean, look, I worked
Mm-hmm.
as a contractor for the Department of Defense for 15 years. Um, and most of the people that I worked with personally were retired military. Most of them, field grade officers, majors, lieutenant colonels, who really did feel a commitment towards the defense of the United States and who honestly felt that they were doing their part, even though, like me, they were no longer in uniform, but they still felt that the defense of the United States was something important that they could still contribute to after their military careers were over, just as I did. So, my example, in uniform and out, I've spent 25 years of my adult life working for the Department of Defense in one way or another, 10 of which on active duty. And yet, there are institutional incentives that the average government worker may not know or be aware of, but their leadership certainly does. You said something interesting. Whenever you're in business, you put your clients' needs ahead of yourselves because that is how you build a reputation. That's how you keep those clients coming back. That's how you keep that money flowing into your coffers. Well, we don't have to worry about that if we work for the government because we don't make a profit. Right? We don't have customers who have to be satisfied. And indeed, whether customers are satisfied or not is fairly low. And by customers, I mean, the general public is fairly low on their list of priorities. What is high on their list of priorities is budgetary, but the budgetary process is different. I have to beg for this money from Congress. And so, therefore, I have to be able to show Congress that I am worth more money, that I need to hire more people, that I need to grow my agency. And so I have to seek out problems that my agency can address, but can only address with more money from Congress.
And look, I spent all of the money you gave me the last time, and I got you all the deliverables, and now we need more stuff. I need more money.
Yes, and my GS-15 job, if I get enough money and hire enough people, automatically becomes a GS-16 job because now my agency or my department has expanded. That is a fundamentally different incentive for the institution than the profit motive is in business. Because in business, you have both positive and negative incentives. I mean, you can, in fact, go bankrupt and have to shut your business down. That's not really a worry if you're in government. So those negative consequences that ameliorate your preferred behaviors, perhaps, as a business person, if my customers begin to hate me, I will no longer have them and I will no longer have a business, that doesn't exist in government. There's one positive incentive. How can I get more money in my agency? The worst thing that can happen, the worst case scenario, as long as I'm spending all the money that I get in the appropriation every year, is that my budget will not grow.
That's the worst.
Yeah, that's the worst case scenario is status quo ante. That's fundamentally different than the private sector.
Yes, absolutely.
And yet,
although there are similarities with where you have essentially not a monopoly but an oligarchy, where you have the big three in the automotive field. When we had that, the big four in the accounting field. The people, all the minions running around doing all the supposed work, they don't care. I mean, they just know if they stick it out, they work in enough different fields, they'll keep getting promoted. They keep switching. They'll switch to other company and then to the other company. They'll get a raise each time. I mean, they know how to work the system. They don't care what happens with the customer because the customer doesn't really care either, because the customer is simply doing this because they have to. And that's usually to satisfy some government compliance thing.
Yeah, they effectively become an arm of the government that
right.
Be a regulation.
It's a bunch of kabuki theater run with numbers.
Yeah, exactly. But in the private sector, you have kind of the same thing. I mean, you do have, as we've mentioned, Vanguard and BlackRock. I mean, how do you deal with those institutions?
Right.
Because millions upon millions of American workers now have 401ks. A substantial number of those 401ks are managed by Vanguard, for example. The company I normally work for basically offers a series of Vanguard 401k options for investment. Well, I don't necessarily want to give Vanguard my money, but what other choice do I have? It's the only
especially if the company is going to be matching part of your contributions.
Yeah, if the company tells me, for every, 1,000 you put in, we're putting in $500, that's a 50% bump.
That's quite an incentive.
I mean, that's an incentive. And yet I'm giving my money to an institution I would prefer not to give my money to. And technically, I could just say, no, give me all that money. I don't want to invest in a 401k. I'll do it myself. But of course, I'm losing 50% of what I might possibly invest. And then, of course, I'm also losing the tax benefit, right? Because
that's right.
Now all of a sudden, that becomes what I have to invest. I have to invest out of my taxable income. So all of that money that was going into my 401k, tax deferred, is now all taxed. And so I'm losing that money. So now it becomes not a 50% premium that I pay to do that myself. It becomes a 70% premium. If I, just average, 20% federal income tax, which is...
Although if you put in a Roth IRA, it will grow tax-free.
Yes, that's true. If you put it in a Roth IRA.
Well, until you, of course, graduate out of that.
But I'm still losing my 50%. Well, look, 401ks.
Yeah, and that's a lot. I mean, that's a big deal.
Yeah, so, these institutions have gotten themselves, even though they're private companies, they've gotten themselves into a position. And by the way, it's not just Vanguard. I think you could say the same thing about Fidelity or Schwab or... Because, there are 401ks.
Goldman Sachs.
there are 401ks that use all of these different investment.
Deutsche Bank.
Vehicles. Yeah. So,
BlackRock is not something that you would necessarily invest in because you have to have a certain amount of money to actually invest.
Yeah, so I'm leaving BlackRock out of the 401k discussion. And I've concentrated on Vanguard, but it's not just Vanguard. There are any number of institutions that are just locked into that. Who also have the ability. Vanguard just happens to be the largest, but I can't imagine that Charles Schwab is far behind, nor can I
Schwab
imagine...
is pretty huge.
Nor can I imagine that Wells Fargo or Citi is very far behind.
Fidelity, there's
Fidelity,
there's a bunch of big ones, especially for the 401k, SEP, different types of IRAs. Yeah, they manage a lot of funds. They're also... they manage a lot of the companies and the sub funds that, all that money pours into. So, yeah, it's a big kind of internecine affair when it comes to, whether you invest with Schwab or Fidelity or whoever, it's all kind of going into the same mix of pots. And it's a lot of the same people who are running the show. Each one has their own products. They have different fee structures and whatever, but they're pretty homogenous.
Yeah, look, a Fidelity S&P index fund is not going to be substantially different than a Vanguard S&P index fund.
Exactly. And you're not going to make a ton of money, but it'll be safe for you. And if you're going to, from the company standpoint, if they're going to recommend something, they're not going to recommend something that's risky. If they're going to be matching, they want to make sure that it's something that has a good reputation behind it and say, hey, you can't blame us. We went with the best, right? So,
your company is not going to pick Bob's Investments to run your 401k plan. There's too much
Stratton Arms.
Yeah, there's too much liability for that. So that gives these big companies an advantage. And this is interesting. One of the big campaign that Vivek Ramaswamy was on before he decided to run for president, if indeed that is what he's doing, was the complaint about these companies like Fidelity or Vanguard or whoever, pushing all of this ESG stuff, which was, hey, I don't have a problem if you're a billionaire and you have a bunch of money and you decide to put your money into ESG in your company. Like, it's your company. You're the one that's going to have to pay the price for that. Your investors will have to pay the price for that. But at least it's a company that you run. And if you're using your money, you can throw it towards anything you want. The trouble with Vanguard or Fidelity is that it's not their money.
Right.
It's other people's money. And I think you get into a really questionable moral area whenever you...
A fiduciary issue.
Yeah, whenever you replace your fiduciary responsibility with ESG. Because I'm just Joe Blow who's working as a welder and who's got a 401k from my construction company, and I'm throwing you 10% of my income every 2 weeks, and I have no say in how you use it. I can't even change my investment except once a year whenever the benefits enrollment period arrives.
Right.
You have full control over my money, and I can't trust you because this is what I'm going to depend on, not to be eating Alpo when I'm 75, and I can't trust you to actively seek for the largest return possible on the money that I give you. And, for all this ESG stuff, I just don't for the life of me understand how come there haven't already been shareholder lawsuits saying you're abandoning your fiduciary responsibility. And I mean, how do you prove that you're reducing returns? I don't know.
That's the problem, is you need a counterfactual, right? You need a control group that is all non-ESG. Well, the problem with that is that, that's where BlackRock has a lot of influence in pushing all these companies. Hey, you want us to invest our money, and we're the largest capitalized fund in the world, then you should maybe think about adhering to our rules. So, of course, if you're in the market for expansion or whatever, you're looking to get money from someplace like a Vanguard or a BlackRock or some other hedge fund, you're going to go along with what they say. And it may work for a little bit, but I would bet in the long run, over the 5-10 year window, you're not going to see as much growth as you would if you concentrated on getting out good products. And that's not to say that being unethical or flouting environmental rules that is going to do you any good either. I mean, I think that's what all companies should be doing. But ESG. Here's a question I have. Does Nike have a high ESG score, I wonder?
I don't know. Just think of all the children to whom they're giving jobs.
Right. And all the Uyghurs in
China
concentration camps.
By the way, for those of you who are watching, I'm getting a notification, although it has just dropped off, that we're having some stream quality issues. It was saying poor, so you may experience some buffering or what have you, which is really going to mess up our rebroadcast. Sorry about that. It's back to excellent now, which is what I would normally expect since I have gigabit internet. But apologies for the poor streaming quality if indeed you were getting poor streaming quality. It was only up there for about a minute, but sorry about that. It just happened. But it looks like we may have gotten over that. So, who knows? The number of hops between my computer and Google is probably pretty large. So
I would expect.
Apologies. Yeah, I don't know. What I do know is that we have a serious institutional problem, and I don't know how to fix it. And, we can talk around the edges of it, but and it's not getting better, it's getting worse. I mean, I can, look, despite the FBI of the 1960s and J. Edgar Hoover's, monumental anti-communism to the point where he was willing, and lack of concern for civil rights in the 1960s. That notwithstanding, the FBI has long been problematic. One of the things I think would help, and that we don't do anymore, is committee hearings to address it. In my lifetime, let's see, we had the church committee going,
like the church committee
going after the FBI, the Watergate hearings.
Right.
Congress isn't doing that anymore. I think part of the problem with these institutions is that Congress seems to have, and this is something we've talked about too for a long time, and I think now we are beginning to see the implications of what that means, is that Congress is not performing their oversight duty on these agencies the way that they would routinely do in the 1960s and 1970s.
Yeah,
the Iran-Contra in the 1980s.
Is this, or Iran-Contra, yeah. Is this weaponization of government committee. But it's not focused on any particular agency. It is highly focused on the DOJ and the FBI, but it's broader than that, and one wonders how much can really be gleaned from that broad of investigation. I mean, obviously one of the problems, I think, is there's this whole conglomerate of the political elite in DC, and one of the suggestions we've made it before, and I'm starting to see more of it, is, you know what, move some of these agencies out of Washington. Why is the Department of Interior headquartered in Washington?
Why isn't it in Wyoming or Montana?
Yeah, or Minnesota even. I mean, Idaho. Why is the DOJ, why isn't that in like Indiana or Missouri? The DOJ and the FBI. Matter of fact, most of its power should be in regional headquarters with, one small tiny office in Washington,
coordinating between the SAC in charge of
exactly
different regions.
Department of Agriculture. Why that's not in Nebraska, I don't know.
Or Iowa.
I mean, we should definitely break up the party. I mean, this is what happened in third grade. I got talking to my best friend Brent too long. They said, "Okay, we're splitting you up." Well, that works. You concentrate more on what you're supposed to be doing than pounding around and doing all the things you're not supposed to be doing and going to the right parties. And that's another thing. We need to start restricting their travel budgets. Unless it is strictly for work, and it must be only for work. No dabbling on the side. Okay, you're overnight, you visit a family member, fine. But no going to some cocktail party with a bunch of donors, no showing up to give a speech. You do that, it's on your own time, it's on your own money.
Well, I thought Congress was supposed to have rules like that anyway, although as far as I can tell, they're far more honored, as Shakespeare said, in the breach than the observance.
Well, I just remember when Christopher Wray decided that he didn't want to stick around to get questioned by Congress anymore because, he had a plane to catch. But it's a private plane, isn't it? Well, yeah, it's a government plane, isn't it? Well, yeah, but I have a meeting. You're going on vacation, aren't you? Well, yeah, but I'm also going to do some meetings while I'm there. Like, what the hell?
Yeah, it's a working vacation.
Plane? It's just. No, we need to stop treating these people like princes and treat them like public servants.
Yeah, I
Civil
mean,
servants.
the Speaker of the House, of all people, gets a private jet that the Air Force supplies her, or him in this case, because we do have a different Speaker of the House now. Why? In fact, if you're a member of Congress, why aren't you flying? I mean, I can see why the government would pay for you, a coach class ticket on United. I can't see why the Speaker of the House has a private jet that the Air Force is picking the tab up on.
Right. I mean, and we already pay for their Secret Service details, which we should. I really don't have a problem with that. We also pay them ungodly pensions forever. Now, at least in the House, it ramps up. It's not, you don't get to serve 2 years and then keep making $170,000 or whatever it is for the rest of your life. It's a percentage, but I mean, they make a shit ton of money for their entire lives. Not to mention all the insider trading going on. I mean, they have it pretty damn well.
Yes, well, it would be a bigger problem if any of them actually left Congress.
Well, that's true. And that unfortunately requires a constitutional amendment. Nobody expected these people to live for as long as they did, nor for them to be in session as long as they are.
Or for them to spend 27 years or 30 or 35 years in a congressional seat.
Well, they all had to maintain actual lives and businesses, and they were running farms and cotton mills and distilleries and whatever else. Law offices. I mean, they had to actually be back there to do that stuff, plus to meet the constituents.
And look, you've got people.
It wasn't supposed to be a lifetime appointment.
Yeah, you got people like Dianne Feinstein, who has not worked
refuses to give up.
Who has not worked in the private sector since she was elected to the San Francisco City Council in the early 1960s. She's been in government for 60 some years now.
Yeah.
And refuses, she's 90 some years old. At what point do you retire? You have Mitch McConnell, who is going through ischemic episodes live on camera multiple times per month. Why is he still there?
I mean, Chuck Grassley's not too far behind, although Chuck seems a lot more
compos mentis
aware. Yeah.
But by the way, commenter, the agencies just ignore Congress. How many times have we seen someone show up at a hearing and then promise to send information at some later date, which never actually happens? Well, all the time. Because Congress, since then, for some reason, something happened between Iran-Contra and today, and I don't know when, and I think it was probably in the George W. Bush era, where Congress just lost interest in doing its job.
I think when they went overboard with the Clinton impeachment, that sort of steeled the bureaucracy against Republicans.
Yeah, but look, Democrats don't do it when they're in charge either.
Well, but Democrats don't insist that the agencies do what they're supposed to do. They're perfectly happy for them to go along with whatever the president says in his executive order.
Yeah, but it was the Democrats who
set law or the Supreme Court says.
But it was the Democrats who set up the church committee.
That is true, but that was in the 60s,
70s,
or 70s.
Yeah, mid 70s, 76, I believe, with the Democratic president, no less.
True.
So, yeah, I think if Congress did, but here's the thing: Congress isn't going to do their job because it's become, how do you pronounce sinecure? Sinecure?
Sinecure.
Sinecure. There you go. That's the pronunciation. I think it has become a sinecure. As soon as I get elected, I know that my chances of re-election just automatically jump to 95%. I probably have a safe seat. and there's not much I have to do. These cocktail parties are important because they fill up my empty life in Washington, D.C.
And they also help fill my coffers.
Yeah, and most of what
so
I
can
do
get elected again.
And most of what I do is constituent service. So
I don't do, yeah. Right.
Assuming
the representative level, maybe, yeah, they do.
Yeah, senators don't, but
no, senators do not do that.
But congressmen do, and that's So I just have to do enough constituent service that I can put out nice flyers at election time. I'm your congressman. Please send me back. I'm doing a great job for you. And 95% of the time, that's going to happen. And when there are House vacancies and Senate vacancies, by the way, they tend to happen whenever a sitting senator decides, 45 years is enough. I guess it's time for me to go and take my lifetime medical care, my lifetime pension, and relax for.
Pierre Delecto finally decided he's going to step down. Mitt Romney.
Oh, Mitt Romney. Yeah, he's decided. Well, look, there are times whenever a politician and his constituency are mismatched. Not entirely sure how Utahns decided to elect Mitt Romney, but I think
he's Mormon.
Yes, but Mitt Romney has a unique political gift that most other politicians don't have, which is the ability to make the people who elected him regret their choice in fairly short order. So Mitt Romney's retirement is making a virtue out of the inevitable, because he's not getting reelected in Utah.
I tend to agree. He saw the writing on the wall. But at least, I don't know. We'll find out. Hopefully he's not going to push for some further political office. He needs to just ride off into the sunset.
It's not like
he's done enough damage.
It's not like, I can't imagine there is any form of government corruption that would compensate him any greater than he has already been compensated throughout his life.
Yeah, that is one of the good things about him, is he's really just not viable.
There are very few people, and Mitt Romney is one of them, who has FU money. So I don't know what the monetary incentive would be for him, because the guy is fantastically wealthy already. But he's not going to be a politician for much longer.
He doesn't seem to be terribly interested in power either. But he certainly does have an interest in this mythical, middle of the road, can't both sides agree. I mean, he has no actual political philosophy. He's just he's a political middle manager.
He is a less asshole-ish version of John McCain, or what John McCain became.
Well, I was going to say what he became. Yeah.
Yeah. Very few people remember that John McCain was a Reaganite firebrand when he first went into Congress in the 1980s. And then it was the Senate that turned him into a maverick. Mitt Romney has always been, we wouldn't call it a maverick, we would call it a moderate.
Milk toast.
Yeah, milk toast. I still, to this day, a decade later, am unsure whether we were well served or dodged a bullet by having Mitt Romney lose the 2012 presidential election.
How he lost that. It's an interesting question, because what would he have actually done? I mean, he certainly would not have served conservatively. He would have served somewhat more conservatively than Barack Obama. We wouldn't have had I don't know that we wouldn't have had Obamacare, since he created the Massachusetts version of Obamacare. He may have compromised on that. We would have probably still gotten a huge boondoggle that is still screwing up medical insurance and costing us just hundreds of thousands of dollars a year.
I think the best case scenario of a Mitt Romney presidency is another Bill Clinton term. in terms of policy.
Sort of. Yeah.
Well, Bill Clinton,
Yeah. Well, Clinton
after
kinda got forced
1994.
back to the right.
Yeah, Bill Clinton after 1994.
Yeah.
So 1995 to 2000, Bill Clinton. That 5 years, I think that would have been where Romney would have been. So yeah, more conservative than Barack Obama, not truly conservative.
I remember conservative voters saying, I would hear him on talk radio saying, "Look, I think Mitt's a nice enough guy. I don't like how they're portraying him, but I don't want to vote for the guy because all this stuff is about to collapse and we're going to get hit hard. And I don't want a Republican standing there holding the bag when it does." And there were quite a few people apparently that thought that way because I guess they figured that if the Democrats are going to create the mess, they should have to deal with the mess. The short-sightedness of that is that they would be forced. It's not like the media was going to put their nose in it and smack them on the hindside and say, bad Democrats, don't do that again. That never happens. They covered up. Oh no, it smells like roses. This is wonderful.
Well, we already, yeah, we have seen this for 2 decades now, where the media is just a partisan cheerleader for the Democratic Party. Glenn Reynolds, years ago, think of reporters as Democratic operatives with bylines, and you won't be far wrong. And I think that's true. I don't think that a Democrat will be held responsible for anything. I mean, look at Joe Biden and look at how we're handling inflation and how the reporting on inflation is working.
How they're reporting the inflation. Yeah, that's even more mind-boggling.
Yeah, look, it's nice that the rate of inflation has fallen.
It's slowed. Yeah.
That doesn't mean that all of the inflation we've experienced over the last 2 years didn't happen. I mean,
or is going away.
Or is going away. I mean, we still have, and of course, this last Friday's inflation numbers were, unsurprisingly bad.
Yeah.
And, if you go back 2 years and you look at the prices for common goods, and, I love how the CPI always excludes the core CPI always excludes the volatile food and energy sectors, which just happen to be the 2 things that people absolutely require to live.
And that energy sector itself feeds into everything
else. Yeah, exactly. And, if you want to look at it over a long period of time, over the last 3 years at this point, we're talking 50% price increases in 3 years for some of these core goods. Well, they're not core in the sense of the CPI, but they're core in the sense of we need them to survive.
Yeah, that's a staple of each household.
Yeah, staple goods, food and energy. And that is where much of the inflation has been. The trouble is, of course, that over time, that has to begin filtering out fairly strongly into all of the other sectors that are not included in the core CPI. So, but whenever you see the readings, well, look, inflation has fallen. No, inflation hasn't fallen. That's just a fallacy. The rate of inflation has slowed, and somewhat. It's not helped by the Fed coming in and saying, well, we have a 2% inflation target anyway. So the assumption that is already built into the Fed is that 2% inflation is a good thing. Inflation is. I
mean, that is the old saw, though.
Is
right?
the grease that
nominal or
the grease that lubricates the wheels of commerce.
Right. Like normal inflation is about 1% to 2% a year, just given demographics and whatever else. But when you're targeting it to 2%, and then we got up a little over 3%. So we got close. Like, well, no, that's more than double where we should be. Especially since we're producing fewer goods, and we're actually making less money in terms of purchasing power. So purchases are going to go down. That's not good. That means we're hitting a spiral, and how do you stop that? Well, the Fed only has one option to raise interest rates.
Well, technically they have two, but
But
one
they
that,
could stop printing money too.
well, okay, technically they have three because they can always raise the reserve requirements on banks,
True.
which is the nuclear bomb of
That's
monetary
like putting
policy.
screen.
Yeah, they tend not to do that.
Yeah.
So, by the way, once again, we are getting intermittent poor and then excellent, and I don't know why. So if you're watching, sorry, there's going to be some clipping and some buffering apparently intermittently.
The Russians are trying to shut us down.
Yeah, that must be what it is. So yeah, just let you know, it's happening off and on. Nothing I can do about it. So you're just gonna have to deal with it. A commenter says, but Krugman said that if we cut out food, fuel, and housing, things are great. Yes, that's exactly the problem.
Other than that, how was the play, Mrs. Lincoln?
Yeah, exactly. Sure, your husband got a bullet in his head, but were the first two acts funny? Let's not lose sight of why we're all here.
Good God. He just, it's a shame because he actually is a very brilliant economic mind. And he just threw it all away for partisanship.
Yeah, he, again, he has corrupted himself. He has prostituted
He really has.
himself. Because if you had asked me in 1999 who one of my favorite economists were, I would have answered without hesitation, Paul Krugman. His critique of Milton Friedman's monetarist monetary policy was, I think, spot on. There were some things that Friedman, and despite the fact that he won a Nobel Prize for it, there were some things that he missed. Nobody's perfect, right? And I think that and most people forget that Paul Krugman won the Nobel Prize for his research on A, market failures are more common than we like to think, and B, government efforts to fix market failures are almost always doomed to failure themselves.
Part of that, a subset of that was about minimum wage laws, which he basically showed, well, what you end up doing is you raise the poverty level of some people, but you ban a lot more people than to not being able to get any jobs. And you make them basically unhireable.
Yeah. Yep. Sorry about that. Hit my
And he held on to
keyboard.
that, I think, correct theory until
he got
early 2000s.
until he got a New York Times column.
Yeah.
Him getting a New York Times column is probably the worst thing that could have happened to him. And
Preach to the choir.
I think the difference between working, well, at the time, working in academia, where in the 1980s and 1990s, you were largely free to espouse pretty much whatever economic theory you wanted to espouse, as long as you had quality research to back it up. And then moving into being a columnist and the incentive of towing whatever line Punch Sulzberger had set out for the paper is fundamentally different. And, he chose Punch Sulzberger over his own Nobel Prize winning work. That's what always just flabbergasts me. I mean, he has written columns that explicitly disagree with the work for which he won a Nobel Prize in economics.
Textbooks. Literally, he contradicts things in his own textbooks.
That takes a special kind of intellectual elasticity that I'm not sure that I could have.
No, it is a shame because he actually really is a very, very, very smart economist when he wants to be. But that's been sort of the trend, it seems. Our so-called experts towing the party line rather than putting these. This is the story of COVID.
Well, look,
You
it's
know,
all part and parcel of the corruption of our
Yeah,
institutions.
yeah, absolutely. And again, it boils down to choosing sides. What's not excusable is the lengths that they'll go. That when they tell knowing falsehoods that harm people, the jab was not good for everybody. They're still not being honest about uh, a lot of the harm.
Look, Pfizer just came out this week with a study they funded, which shows that the vaccines offer literally no benefit for anyone under 5 years of age.
Yeah,
None
and yet
whatsoever.
they're trying to mask kids in school and jab them.
Exactly. And yet they want children of that age to receive COVID vaccinations. Why? We now have what appears to be reliable data funded by Pfizer itself that says vaccination in that age group offers no benefits. So why are we doing it?
And that isn't the first study. We've actually had several studies that have already shown that.
Yeah, and the only answer I can come up with is because the FDA wants to give billions of dollars to Pfizer or Moderna.
It's one of the reasons, but I think the major reason is they want to keep the population under control. And there's an election year coming up, and they want to do another, hoodwink with the whole mail-in ballots and putting boxes all over the place and not checking, what comes in or who put it there or anything else. They need to ensure that their cheating works again.
Well, see, here's the thing. And in that scenario, and this is what is so insidious about it, right? Is that if we can run an election where we largely can't take each ballot and certify it as being, a ballot that was submitted by someone who is on the voter rolls. If we can divorce the actual ballot process from any sort of security, then what that allows, even if I say we at the national level, even if we don't cheat, I've made it easy for a lot of other people to cheat. And so I don't have to do any cheating myself. I just have to set up a situation where anyone who wants to cheat can and have a very small chance of getting caught. Now, after the 2020 election, there were a couple of election supervisors and stuff like that who did get caught and convicted of, doing various nefarious things here and there. Some Democrats, some Republicans got caught. But if you set up a system that makes cheating easy, you're at the very least complicit in such a system, even if you're not doing the cheating yourself. And I think that's one of the reasons why, and by the way, this is one of the reasons why Trump's complaints about Georgia and Florida but especially Georgia, are so incomprehensible to me. Because Georgia, and Florida as well, but Georgia set up a system that 3 years ago was Jim Crow 2.0, remember? Requiring that,
But that was after the 2020 election.
No, it wasn't. It was before the 2020
Yes,
election.
No, it was after the 2020 election. And they were set up because of the 2020 election.
I know that Florida completely redid their balloting after 2000.
They did theirs under Jeb Bush.
Okay, I was thinking that was prior to the 2020 election.
In Florida, yeah, but not Georgia. Georgia was done after the 2020 election because it was Joe Biden who came in and said that it was, if you pass these laws, they're going to be, it's Jim Crow 2.0. It was in response to the issues that went on during the 2020 election. And especially in places like Fulton County and DeKalb.
Okay, well, I guess we have to wait to see if those voter measures were. I was certain that was prior to 2020.
No, it was after, but we did, and we saw that not
No,
only
wait a second. It had
was
to
the
have been.
ballot,
It had to have been because Kemp was already governor.
he got elected governor. Remember, he got elected governor in 2020 while he was still the Secretary of State, and against Stacey Abrams.
Right. He did.
And she kept complaining that he was Secretary of State.
Okay, yeah. Georgia lawmakers changed voting laws after 2020, including eliminating draw. Okay, all right. Well, I was wrong. Well, okay. Still doesn't invalidate.
In any case, though, what Trump complained about, a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it, and what he went to court to challenge, and we brought this up before. It was too little, too late. It should have been brought up long before the election, but he eventually was vindicated in court, just not in time to actually do anything about it vis-a-vis the election.
Yeah, because the election had already occurred.
Yeah, the courts didn't have any way to. They had no power to change anything. They could not fashion a remedy based on their statutory and legal ability. So that's why all those suits got rejected. Now you hear all the time, well, he presented all these arguments and they all got rejected. Well, no, what he presented were process issues. Those got rejected. He never presented any, hey, I have proof that, X, Y, and Z voted when they were allowed to, and that, person, whoever brought in all these illegal ballots or whatever. That was never presented to the court. What was presented was, hey, they changed the rules in the middle of the game that went against the Constitution of the state, went against the U.S. Constitution, all this stuff. And that's where he won a bunch of cases, notably in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, after everything was said and done, which didn't do him any good.
Yeah, the time to make.
He was right about that.
Yeah, but the time to make those arguments was in May and June.
Exactly. It was, well,
not in November.
Absolutely not in November. There should have been all kinds of injunctions and everything else going on long before that, and they didn't. They dropped the ball.
Yeah, and I think back to was it 2021? Whenever was it 21 or 22? Mike Lindell held some sort of symposium where he said, "I've got the absolute proof that the election was stolen."
Yeah, I think that was in 21.
And I'm going to be presenting this proof, and once I present it, by September, Donald Trump will be reinstated as president. No, that's never going to happen. Even if you had the proof, there is no mechanism, certainly no legal mechanism, whereby we can go back and just say, okay, well, that election is now overturned. Donald Trump gets to return triumphantly to the White House in September as the legitimate president. That's not going to happen.
And frankly,
the Electoral College has already voted.
That's exactly right. I agree with there being no mechanism to do that. There's got to be some finality. There's got to be a cutoff date so we can move forward. The rest of it is then just a political issue. Vote the bum out. That's what should happen. Stymie him politically every way you can. Vote in people who will, shut down his agenda in Congress. But no, there's no this. Oh no, you're illegitimate. We're going to start over. No, that should never be how it works. This isn't. We're not little kids playing in the sandbox. Okay, we're going to start over, and Jessica gets to be the leader this time.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, whether we would agree or disagree on a prudential basis as to whether it should work that way, the simple fact is that there's no mechanism to make that occur.
That's right.
And look, I mean, technically, state laws to the contrary. I mean, technically, you could win the popular vote in a state and win all of the electors, and then they could all get together in the state capitol on December 6th and not vote for you anyway.
That's right.
I mean, yes, we do have. And now, look, they might end up
There
being.
are state laws against faithless electors.
They
Yeah.
might be prosecuted for doing so. But
How far that would go, I don't know.
yeah, but once they've made that call and they've sent their vote to Congress for certification, it's over. So even in the
Yeah.
case of a whole bunch of faithless electors who throw the election in a completely different manner, we don't have a do-over that just says, okay, well, we throw out everything now and we redo the electoral college and he actually won, so you have to leave office. When? Tomorrow? Next week?
And the score is now 4-6, and
Yeah.
it's Powerball.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know what that mechanism would look like. What I do know is that mechanism doesn't exist, and it's fantasy to say otherwise. That, I mean, look, we technically, I think, could go back and declare Richard M. Nixon the victor of the 1960 presidential election. It still wouldn't matter.
Although he couldn't do worse. Corpse on the...
Yeah, but I mean, that was just never going to happen. And maybe that is our system is built on the assumption, again, that our institutions work and that our election systems are fair and free.
Well, that
and
they're built on the idea that we can. There's a time to fight about this, and that you have built-in ability to challenge injustice. But as with all challenges to injustice, I mean, just look, we have statute of limitations for a reason. As with all built-in challenges to get to the justice of thing, there's going to be a timeline. Some are quick, some are long, but there's got to be an end. We can't let grievances and feeling wrong go on forever. At some point it's got to cut off because we actually have something to do, and we're talking about a functioning system. Functioning system cannot just be held up at a whim. It's got to actually have, okay, we sort this out, we sort that out, we sort that out. Okay, here's a blockage, sort that out, and you keep moving forward.
And it has to be sorted out within a specific amount of time.
Exactly.
That's true for both civil and nearly all criminal offenses.
Correct. Yeah, other than, I think rape and murder.
Yeah. So, that system works, and the electoral system basically works the same way. But boy, after December 6th, that window for changing the election results, that's closed.
It is very narrow. I mean,
Yes.
and there's an argument to be made that maybe we should have some sort of actual rules to address these sorts of situations that we've seen since 2000.
Is there?
I mean, there's an argument to be made. I'm not saying I'm swayed by it, but it's not an unreasonable argument. I'm not sure that it's a workable one. I mean, it sounds good in theory. I don't know that it in practice it does anything other than hold up the administration of government, which
Not that I care particularly.
The government's not doing anything. That to me is a good day. But obviously there are security concerns with that sort of stuff.
Well, here's what's going to happen immediately. If you come up with some sort of system that says, look, after the election, if you think you were cheated about it, here is a mechanism to address it. And what's going to happen? What's going to happen is that the loser of every election, certainly if this is a federal law, every House, Senate, and presidential election, every loser is immediately going to file suit for some sort of election interference. Right. And they're going to delay,
gum up the works for as long as possible. The courts only have a limited amount of time.
to go through all of these arguments. I mean, it's just going to clog the court system with a whole bunch of last-ditch efforts not to lose. And again, the time requirements are so freaking narrow here. You've got till December 6th at the presidential level. You've got till December 6th until the president meets. If you're a congressional or senatorial election, you've got until January 3rd when the new Congress takes over. And then again at the presidential level, January 20th for the inauguration.
Interestingly enough, we have seen these sorts of things drag out in especially House of Representatives, because it's not as important. It's you're one of 435 people. Who cares? So they allow that to drag on. Senators are a bit different, obviously. But the president, I mean, that's a singular entity. I mean, somebody's going to have to be in charge of that branch. People elected it. As far as we know, it was fair and square. That's the best we can do.
I mean, technically, I suppose you could make the Speaker of the House the acting president until...
Oh, yeah, that would work out great.
Until the issue was resolved. The trouble is...
I'm in charge.
Yeah, the trouble is, as a practical matter, the time limit between the first Tuesday in November and January 20th is pretty small. And and that's just for the president. It's till January 3rd for a House or Senate race. And what we do at the state level, who knows? I just don't know.
That's the other problem is, in any other case, you're dealing with a district or a state. With the presidential level, you're dealing with all of it. I mean, it's overwhelming.
Yeah, so I don't know how you fix that problem. What I do know is that Trump should have had lawyers for his campaign in court
way earlier.
In April and May. I mean, as soon as these Secretary of States just started saying, well, who cares what the election law is? We're just going to make a change willy-nilly right now. That should have immediately gone into federal court.
And we're going into court in the states. They were going into court to get the judges to approve their change of the election procedures. And that's where Trump's people should have been. That's where the Republicans should have been, saying, hey, whoa. Judge, you don't have the authority to decide this. This is legislative. You actually don't have any power here whatsoever, unless you're going to find it's unconstitutional or it somehow falls afoul of the law. You don't have the ability to change this. It's not within your...
It's a plenary power of the state legislature.
Right. And that's where they should have been making that argument. Like you said, back in April, May, when these things started bubbling up.
But of course, if you make that argument, then the argument you're making is, or it will certainly be portrayed as, you want to turn Election Day into a super spreader event to make everyone get COVID.
Yeah, okay.
And whatever you may want to say about Donald Trump and how much of his policies you liked, I think Donald Trump was a failure at COVID management.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's pretty obvious, I think.
I mean,
the only thing he did well was get the FDA emergency approval process done quickly, albeit for fairly ineffective, actually a 100% ineffective vaccine, a somewhat effective prophylactic. That's all he managed to do. He did shut down the country. He did let Fauci and Birx basically take over everything. He gave Fauci like the Medal of Honor or something ridiculous.
He gave him
Presidential Medal of Honor?
no. He gave him a presidential commendation as he was on
Commendation?
his way
Okay,
out.
yeah.
Which I don't know if you saw any part of his interview with Megyn Kelly,
I,
but
I didn't see it, but I read about it.
I mean, she just asked him straight up. Look, there's a lot of people who think Fauci just screwed this up. That for whatever his motives were, he was wrong, and you supported him all the way, and you gave him a commendation on the way out the door. And Trump had the gall to look her in the eye and say, well, I don't know who gave him that commendation. Okay, well, your signature is at the bottom of it. So
it's called the presidential commendation.
So it would appear to have been you. And of course,
it really has become just an absolute everything that he said he was going to fight against.
Yeah, and look, he was going out publicly castigating Brian Kemp and Ron DeSantis for opening Florida and Georgia. And in fact, Georgia opened before Florida did.
Yes, it did.
And
then South Dakota, Kristi Noem never shut it down. He went after her, but now he praises her and what's his face, McMaster from South Carolina, who was also one of the early ones to open up because they've endorsed his everything about his feelings towards anybody is about fealty. It's about it's his narcissism. It's whether or not they back him and stay loyal to him. That's all he cares about.
Yeah, there is just listening to what he says, listening to the content of his speeches and his public statements and the tweets that he makes. There's a fundamental difference between 2020 Donald Trump and 2016 Donald Trump. His
Absolutely. Message
in 2024 is all about himself.
Mm-hmm.
Now he often couches this in terms that he has to vindicate himself because that's how he fights for you, and that right. If they can do this to me, they can do this to you. But as far as the issues that affect regular people, a lot of that has fallen by the wayside, and this is really all about his own vindication. At least that's how I see it.
Well, he exhibits the fatal conceit that only I can actually do this.
It's the General George P. McClellan campaign argument in 1864. I know that I can save this country and that I alone can.
And that's essentially what he's saying. I mean, and that is how he comes across. That's a good reference, by the way.
Yes. One of the more spectacularly unsuccessful presidential campaigns in American history. It reminds me of the story of Abraham Lincoln, who, when visiting the Army of the Potomac, said to one of his aides, "Look down there and tell me what you see." And his aide said, "Why, sir, that is the Army of the Potomac." And Lincoln said, "No, that is General McClellan's bodyguard." Which, well off of the subject. General McClellan, an excellent administrator, an excellent organizer, an excellent planner, and the last person in the world you want to give operational control of anything. And replaced by Ulysses S. Grant, a mediocre planner and everything else. But a man who had an eye for the main chance and who had no hesitation about throwing whatever he had at whatever the problem was, if there was a chance of success. Sometimes administrative ability is far too overrated, which I believe I have a point. As hard as it may be to believe, I have a point. Which I think points to one of the central problems with our institutions, which is they are all run by people with relatively outstanding administrative ability, and yet no tactical or strategic ability for action.
this is always there's always tension between these two positions, right? Um, the person of action, you know, damn the torpedoes straight ahead, as
Admiral Farragut.
Admiral Farragut said, and the careful planner, which is extremely important at winning a war, because tactics win battles, but it's always the logistics that win the war, and that's super important. But the problem with managing a war is you manage yourself into a corner. At some point, you have to take bold action. You've just got to finish this.
And look, it's not just war. It's administration in general.
War could be almost anything.
Almost anything. Business, government, it doesn't matter. It's interesting when you look back in American history at the intellectual, if not intellectual giants, at least the most intellectually capable presidents that we have tended to be the worst presidents in terms of policy and action.
Okay, well, it depends on how we're considering the best president.
Okay, well, look, Woodrow Wilson. I mean, he was a college professor.
Like, probably the worst president ever.
Yeah, he was president of Columbia University. Awful president. No real concept of, and this is
hated the Constitution.
This is amazing.
Couldn't understand why he can just do whatever he wanted to do.
Yeah, and it's amazing for his era, in which there was genuine respect for the Constitution and its limits in general in government, and he was a man who had practically none of it. And who always bemoaned...
Practically, he had none.
Yeah, he always bemoaned why he could not simply act as a dictator. And to the extent that he could, such as it wasn't the Alien and Sedition
It was
Act.
it was the treason. Shit. Yeah, it was the speech codes or whatever it was.
Yeah, but awful. Jimmy Carter, a nuclear engineer. Not a job that
super smart guy
that generally allows the unintelligent to be successful at it. Awful president.
Micromanaged his way into an absolute disaster in Iran.
Exactly. Richard Nixon, a very smart fella.
Extremely smart fellow, especially considering that he was homeschooled for a lot of his life.
Yeah, well, schooling has nothing to do with innate smarts. Richard Nixon was smart.
That's true.
He was very smart. Then you look at our dumb presidents and what they were able to accomplish. I mean, he wasn't a stupid man, but I don't think anyone would have considered Theodore Roosevelt an intellectual giant.
No, but I mean, he was certainly not a dumb guy. And he was bold.
And
very bold.
It's the penchant for bold action, I think. And look,
Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was no super scholar.
No.
But his penchant for bold action was that's the reason he was the hero in the world.
One of the things about Donald Trump.
Washington.
One of the things about Donald Trump, and I think one of the things that contributes to why so many people like him, is that, whether you care for his personality or not, he is a man who is inclined towards bold action. Whether he is as equally inclined to follow through is open for debate, but certainly a man of bold action. And the Abraham Accords, which the Biden administration has now essentially, as of today, with the announcement of the Arabs to just basically withdraw from it, that would have been a world historical change had he...
At the time it was.
Yeah. Had he been around to shepherd that through. Now, of course, it's dead as fried chicken thanks to Joe Biden, and we are now back to status quo ante, where we were via Israel and the Arab world and the Palestinians. So we're now sort of back in a pre-2016 world. Thank you, Joe Biden.
I did that.
Yeah. So one thing you do have to say about Trump, he was a man of action. He never
And he was
managed.
extraordinarily successful at getting not everything through, obviously, but a lot of the major things he talked about. He got our energy sector back on track to the place where we were a net exporter by the end of his presidency.
He got a border wall
He
partially built.
partially built and on its way to getting further built, and he put in place policies that retarded the overwhelming um, uh, number of migrants that were coming across the border. He put a pretty good damn lasso on China, which in ways that I didn't think would work with all the tariffs and stuff, and he did that with Europe as well. And I'll be damned if that shit didn't work. He also got NATO countries to start ponying up.
Yeah, to actually start paying some of the money that they were supposed to be paying into NATO that we were picking up the tab for.
And then the Abraham Accords was like gravy. That was amazing. He put Russia on notice, and we blew up their shit in Syria, and dared them to come into the Black Sea. I mean, he kept them hemmed up pretty good.
It's weird that, and this is one of the strange dichotomies about his administration, and I think we'll probably end this after pulling on this particular thread, since we're an hour and 40 minutes into this. For all of the nice things he said about Vladimir Putin publicly, and he said a lot that I found difficult to stomach. When it came time to kill a couple of hundred Russian soldiers in Syria, he didn't hesitate for a second. And like you said, with Russia in the Black Sea, he said, try it. When it came down to brass tacks, and maybe this is just a negotiation style, where he just publicly did not want to humiliate Putin, and so he would say nice things about him in public, while in terms of policy, he had pretty well hemmed Putin in with examples of how America would respond. So the Syria situation is had it been any other president who did that, I think Vladimir Putin would have had a question. Is he really ready to go to war with the Russian Federation over Syria? And there might have been a question mark. I think in Donald Trump made it clear that, yes, I will go to war over Syria if you want to push us. Barack Obama...
Trump said at one point afterwards that, he maybe believed me like 5%, but that's all it took.
Yeah, exactly. And, Barack Obama's red lines, which were crossed constantly because nobody believed that Barack Obama would back up what he was saying. And Donald Trump, as nice as he was about Donald Putin, saying things that I found actually sickening in terms of, oh yeah, Putin is a genius. He's very well loved by his country, blah, blah, blah. All this stuff that just grated on me. The fact was his policy towards Russia was a lot more aggressive than people gave him credit for, which is why it's weird. It was
very TR.
Which is why
Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah, which is why it was weird that for so long, well, for his entire presidency, there was this Russian collusion thing hanging over him. Look, if Russia wanted him to be the president from a policy perspective, that turned out
pretty dumb.
That turned out to be the dumbest choice they could have made. They would have done much better, it seems to me, with Hillary Clinton as president.
They already had her in the bag. They had already done so many deals together. I mean, the whole Ross Adam thing. I bet people don't even remember that. I mean, the sheer number of sideline deals that the Clinton initiative and Russian oligarchs had made, the closeness with which Putin and Hillary Clinton were connected, not so much directly. I mean, obviously they had directly met each other, but they had a lot of interests in common. They were both They're both oligarchs looking to make as much money off the public largesse as possible.
Yeah, and the weird
They're
thing,
simpatico.
yeah, and the weird thing is that you've got Russian oligarchs just shoving money at Hunter Biden. And yeah, okay, whatever.
There's no evidence.
Yeah, no
There's
evidence.
no direct evidence.
Yeah, that was the thing that really got me about that AP story. There's no evidence that Joe Biden. Yeah, there's no proof.
Don't you have like 20 shell companies set up throughout the Caribbean and around the world in order to get paid legitimate money for? Well, we don't know what it was for, but it was paid.
Yeah, look, that's the thing that got me about. And for those, well, now we've gone on to a completely separate topic, unplanned. But for those but while we're here, what the hell? Let's beat this dead horse too. The AP came out with a story that said the Republicans are impeaching Joe Biden despite the fact that there is no evidence that he's done anything wrong. Evidence and proof are two different things. There is no proof that Joe Biden did anything wrong, but don't ever say there's no evidence.
And impeachment and impeachment inquiry are two different things as well.
Yes. So, and by the way, they're also going after Kevin McCarthy, saying, well, there should be a vote on this. Really? Nancy Pelosi didn't hold one.
Yeah, it was called a snap. Neither time. It's called a snap impeachment. And she used that for the second time.
Yeah, on the second
one.
one?
Make sure that she could do it before he left off.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah.
Which was absolutely pointless.
Yeah, well, the whole idea was to try to prevent him from running ever coming back in 2024, which...
they make him into Napoleon, which is just... It's like, did you read history?
Yeah, well, it's like this 14th Amendment.
Came back, right?
Yeah, well, it's like this 14th Amendment argument that they're pushing now, too. That's not going to go anywhere. If you thought you were going to get rid of him, you didn't. And look, all the available evidence is that he's going to be the nominee in 24, too. So
if you strike me down, I shall become stronger.
I shall become more powerful than you could possibly imagine. All right, look, Michael, have a great week. We'll talk to you next time. You've been watching the Q&O podcast. Wait, that's the wrong screen. That's not the one I wanted to show. I wanted to show that one. You've been watching, not the Q&O podcast, the Observations podcast. Q&O doesn't exist anymore. The Observations podcast for the 17th of September 2023. As always, we thank you for joining us. We're glad to be back after our hiatus. Hopefully we'll get back into the groove here on a weekly basis moving forward, at least until December anyway. Have a great week. We'll talk to you next week. So long.